we're seeing this letter to the Hebrews continue to develop its whole thought. In the first chapter, we saw the emphasis on Christ's divinity, how he is the character of the Father, the very impression, like a seal makes an impression in wax or lead, so also God's being made the impression in him. That's what they mean by his character. And it emphasizes his divinity by talking about how the angels serve him. Apparently, there were some folks among the recipients of this letter who seemed to have thought that Christ was an angel and not God. And as such, they began to hypothesize that he's something less. And Hebrews makes it clear he's not an angel. In fact, as he quotes in chapter 1, verse 6, all the angels of God worship him. This is extremely important because, as we know from the commandments, you shall worship the Lord your God alone. Now, the angels of God can only worship God, therefore. They can't worship anything less than God. And that strong emphasis on Christ being superior to the angels, having a name superior to theirs, is made very strong and clear throughout chapter 1. But now, here in chapter 2, verse 14, we see why this was such a problem for the recipients of the letter. His humanity. In fact, we oftentimes hear St. Paul speak of the scandal of the cross. It's the scandal of the incarnation itself that is at stake. That so many folks find it difficult to understand that Jesus is God, truly made man. That's why some people went to the other extreme and said, oh yeah, he's God, but he only looked human. He wasn't really human. And that's why it says here, since the children share in blood and flesh, Jesus likewise shared in them. The temptation was to follow the ideas of the pagan gods. The pagan gods, a number of times, especially in the Greek and Roman pantheon, they would frequently take human shape. They would look like a human. And it was natural that people who lived in that world would be tempted to think that is what Jesus did. He sort of was God looking like a human being, but wasn't really human. He didn't take our full nature. And that struggle with the pagan idea of only looking like a human but not really being human, taking on the full human nature, sort of play acting at being human. That temptation kept coming back over the next few hundred years after the time of Christ and the writing of this letter, which is probably in the 60s AD. Sometimes they say he had only one nature, the Monophysites. Sometimes they said he had only one will, a divine will, didn't have a human will. That was the Monothelites. And other variations on that denial of his full humanity. And here he says, no, he shares in that flesh and blood. Or as St. John says, because we read from Hebrews 1 as well as from John 1 on Christmas morning, that the Word became flesh and was truly human. This is something that is necessary. That's part of what Hebrews is trying to bring out. He was not only truly taking on human nature. He was not play acting like the myths of the pagan gods would teach. And by the way, one other point about the pagan gods. Whenever they looked human, it was almost always to do some kind of mischief against a human being that they lusted after or wanted to avenge or some other nasty thing. While in contrast to those myths, what we see here in Scripture is that he shared in flesh and blood so that he might destroy the one who has power over death and free those who through fear of death have been subject to slavery all their life. Now this is another reason for us to reflect. This sense that fear of death subjects us to slavery. A lot of folks don't know how to deal with death. A very common inscription in Roman tombs was, and I quote, "I was not, I was, I am no longer, I don't care." Life was futile for the pagans. He said, I didn't used to exist, I did for a while, I don't exist now, who cares? Because they saw nothing afterwards, and therefore all they had was this life. And when you think only about having this life now and the things in it, then you can easily become afraid of things like pain. So you use drugs and alcohol to deaden the pain and the fear. And those are very obvious elements to which people easily become enslaved. The alcoholic and the drug addict will tell you about enslavement once they start trying to get out of it. They'll tell you what a slave it is. When they're caught in it, they think, oh, this is the best thing ever. But once they start to realize how this is destroying them, then they experience the slavery and their own inability to overcome the power of alcohol and drugs. But you also have a lot of people who are terrified of loneliness in this life. They want to be with someone, and they will go from one bad relationship to another. Why is it bad? Relationship and love is good. But they easily move from one relationship by which they use others, and very typically, they are just as manipulated and used as the other person. And that's why this one fool wrote a song, Addicted to Love. Well, it wasn't addicted to love. He was addicted to lust. And he just didn't know a big enough vocabulary, perhaps. I didn't want to name what was going on. But it was addicted to lust, which becomes mutually manipulated. And people use each other and get caught up in a variety of negative effects as a result. It's easy to become addicted to possessions, to having a lot of things or money, and forgetting that, as much as you might have, you can use some of it maybe to make a gold casket. If you want to do that, if you have enough billions, I don't know why you'd want to do it, because then after a fairly short time, no one's going to see your casket anymore. One of my favorite stories of that was the lady who loved her dog and her Mercedes. And so she bought 3 plots. She was very wealthy. And she was buried in the Mercedes. and had the dog put to sleep and buried next to her. And my favorite part of that was the words of the guys digging this enormous grave 6 feet under where they could drive the car into it. And their line was, "Man, that's living." Not anymore. That car could have been used much longer than the grave. But that kind of fear of death, and I do want to take it with me, is an impossible dream. You can't take it with you, and it helps you not when you do stand before God. And the fear of death that manifests itself in trying to get money, power, sex, alcohol, and altered states of consciousness, and on, all of that is a fear of death that subjects us to various kinds of slavery. Don't we talk about our politicians who sometimes become so addicted to power that they will sell their core values the longer they hang around the people who have money and power in Washington and other places? The longer they start to take on those values to please them, and they become more concerned about power for themselves or their party than they do for the good of the nation and the good of the world. It's easy temptation to fall into a slavery. And that doesn't, by the way, that happens to all the party members of all parties. Doesn't matter. And politicians around the world do that. And Christ, as he said, it did not help the angels. They don't need his help. They're already, the good angels are already redeemed. The evil angels are already condemned. They can't be changed. So he comes for the descendants of Abraham. And he becomes like his brothers and sisters in every way except sin. It's the one way he's different from us. Now then, again, there's another temptation in the modern world. You see it manifested in a variety of places. For instance, Nikos Kazantzakis wrote a novel called The Last Temptation of Christ. It became a movie. Why was he excommunicated by the Greek Orthodox Church for that novel? It's because he described Christ as having a temptation come from within him, a temptation to lust for Mary Magdalene that was interior. And a lot of people said, well, he was human. Yes, he was. But he did not have original sin or any actual sin. He didn't have, original sin is about having disordered desires come from within ourselves. Christ didn't have original sin. So he didn't have disordered temptations of disordered desires coming from within him. All of his temptations come from outside of him. Yes, he's tempted by the devil. By St. Peter, when Peter says, don't talk about the crucifixion. That was a temptation. And he has to say, get behind me, Satan. He's tempted by the crowd that wants to make him a king if he'll give them more bread. They want stuff. And if he were to obey that, he would then fit into their slavery to getting free stuff. And making him king. I'll let you be my ruler. I'll be a slave to you if you give me stuff. And he won't accept that temptation either. So he's tempted from outside of himself, but not inside. That's why he's like us in all things except sin. And this is something that is extremely important for the modern world to understand, as it has been for the ancient world. Being a sinner is not at the essence of being a human. The truth about humanity is revealed more to us by Jesus Christ, who is without original sin or actual sin. His sinlessness tells us what it means to be truly human. That's where we learn about humanity, and that overcoming our sin, dealing with the struggle against the slavery to sin, that is what it means to be human, to be like Jesus. And seeing that as normal, not as so many folks say, well, of course they're human, they're all slaves to sin. Well, yes, but that's not where you stop. We want to become free of it. That is exactly why Jesus our Lord said in the Gospel of John, if you become my disciples, you will know the truth, and that truth will set you free. That freedom from the slavery to sin and slavery to fear of death is precisely what Christ is able to show to us. This is his task for us. And because he became one of us, because he became human, he became the one true high priest who can offer sacrifice for us. And he's able to help those who are being tempted by what he suffered. He's able to resonate with us. And that's why, we talked before about those who are enslaved to alcohol or drugs. It is at the cross that Jesus is offered wine mixed with myrrh, which was a painkiller. And he refuses it. By his refusal, that is how he wins the grace of being able to overcome the temptation to addictions. No matter what the drug might be, he gives the strength. As all the alcoholics I know make very clear when they start recovery, they say, I am helpless over alcohol or drugs or sexuality or gambling or overeating and so on. I'm helpless, but God is more powerful than my addictions. And where does Christ give us that strength? When he refuses, and we can go through his whole life and see that at every step he is giving us the strength to become holy as he is holy. We can't do it on our own, but he can make it possible. His grace makes that possible, and he sets the norm for what it means to be human. Because as he's going to go on to develop, that the rest of this letter is going to be moving toward understanding what it means for Christ to be the high priest and the victim that he offers. But we'll have to wait for the rest of this epistle to find out what he teaches.